So we've talked about this activated root, which then has a snapshot on. And what I've discussed is this ability to create a new item or click on an existing one. And we're using the same form, but all of the buttons are essentially unaware. Now, what we could do is look for an ID on our particular item, but I don't like relying on data structure properties to tell me whether I'm creating something or not. While it might be perfectly valid to do so, I think there's perhaps a better way. So in this lesson, we're going to discuss and implement the idea of a rooted component. So we have our admin module. These are our rooted components. Even though they are smart containers, we're still using them for our routing. So what we essentially want to do is work out how to differentiate this component to this component so we know whether we're creating a new one or editing an existing one. Now in Angular, we have a data property, which then exists on our root object. You can see that we have data and we can then create an object. This is some data that we can then pass through to each particular root. So if we then copy this, we can add it to our dynamic ID. So what we're essentially going to do is differentiate them via a property of isEdit. So when we are editing an existing item, this property is then going to have the value of true, which means that when we are creating a new one, our isEdit is then going to be false. So we'll save this out, and things have been nicely reformatted as they extend way past our line length. So we can then see our path, the component, any data that we are then binding. If we're viewing an existing one, we know that we are now in edit mode. So let's jump into our donut single component. What we essentially want to do is pass down to the form whether or not we are editing. And we're going to create a property called isEdit. And we can then just pass down our isEdit property. But we don't have this available to us just yet. We need to go and get it from our router state. So here we can add another property to our component. We can say it's going to have a value at runtime, which is going to be of type Boolean. And the way that we can access the edit property is almost similar to accessing our parameter map. We do this on our root snapshot. So what we can do underneath our data is say this.isEdit equals the result of this.root.snapshot, and we have a .data property. Now this .data, if we hover over here, it gives us the activated root snapshot data property, the static and resolved data of this root. Now because it's a piece of static data, we can simply do .isEdit. So let's save this out, and we get our property is not enabled on our form. So let's jump up to our donut form, grab our item. We already have our input enabled. So what we're essentially going to do is then pass that property through. So we can jump down underneath our donut. We can say at input is edit, exclamation, and then that's going to be of type Boolean. What we're going to do for now is just simply log it out. And we'll do this underneath our button just for demonstration purposes. So when we then save this out, our application reloads, we then have the value of true. If we then go back, new donut, we should then have our value of false. So now we know 100% whether we are inside an existing item or not. Now there's also a slightly newer syntax with TypeScript is to use a square bracket lookup. Now this is called an index lookup. And the idea is that because our .data doesn't know what this property is, that it will be safer typed as a string like this. Now, this is actually the default behavior. However, I have disabled it for the purposes of this course because I wanted to show you both of them. But going forward, this is the TypeScript recommendation on how to access the property on our .data that doesn't have a type definition because we're trying to access a property, whereas this is actually using a .get API. So this is very different in the way that we're accessing and asking for a property. Both are completely valid and they do the exact same thing. This is just the preferred TypeScript style. So with this in mind, what we've done is now pass down our isEdit to our donut form. So we now want to then start showing and hiding these buttons based on whether they're going to be relevant to our isEdit state. So our create, We only want to hide this if we are editing an existing item. So for this, we can jump into the Angular logic. We can say ngIf that is edit property. However, because we do not want to show it if we are editing, we need to then invert our expression. So when this gets saved out, and we then have our button that's completely hidden. We still have the ability to update it. However, we've not actually touched the form, so our update's disabled. We can delete, of course, and we can also reset the form should we wish. So it makes sense for these buttons to be fully visible to us, which means that our update is also going to be similar to this, as is the delete. So here we're going to say ngIf, and then we're going to pass in isEdit. And similarly on our delete button, we can also pass in ngIf isEdit. So we end up with update and delete, which are then shown when we are editing an existing item. We can then go back, click on new, and then we see the ability to reset or create that particular product from our form. Now, while we're here, what I'm also going to add is an ngIf to our reset button to add some further behavior. So we're going to say ngIf equals, and we're going to say form.touched. So we're only going to show this reset button if we have in fact touched the form. So you can see that we have create. It might be that we then start filling out some details and we want to then reset our form. We could obviously go back, click, and we then have our pre-populated form definition. So it might be that we want to then start over again. So we could say form.touched or isEdit. So we only want to show that slight user experience addition. If we are editing an existing one, we can then reset it and then update it accordingly. Or we could go back, create a new one, start modifying some of the values, and then reset it. So this is just a nice small addition that we can add. And you can also see how we're using some Angular expressions as well. So that is it for taking our admin module's data property. You can pass anything you like down to these. What we've then done is used our existing activated route that we've imported, and we've created a new property in our smart component. So one thing I'm also going to say is our smart component is a great place to not only deal with services, but the outside world, which definitely ties into our routing. We then took our isEdit property, we then bound it to our donut form, we passed it down to the form, and then we set up the functionality to show and hide our buttons accordingly. We also made a small feature addition by only toggling our reset form button if the user has actually edited it. Otherwise, they can see it when they hit up an existing item. So with this in mind, let's jump into the next video where we're going to learn how to programmatically navigate around our application, which involves not using a declarative API, but an imperative API through Angular's router.